The Taliban have warned that they will not negotiate on the deadline for allied troops leaving Afghanistan and say there will be consequences if the mission isn't completed by the end of this month.
Well, at today's virtual G7 meeting, the UK is expected to urge President Biden to delay the withdrawal of US forces, with thousands still trying to flee. We're now joined by the Shadow Foreign Secretary Lisa Nandy. Good morning to you. So the expectation is Boris Johnson will be asking President Biden for this delay. We're already hearing this morning, though, that the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace is saying it's unlikely there will be an extension. What do you think should happen with this?
Well, the reality is it's a very challenging situation. The President has made clear, not just since he was elected, but before then in his election manifesto, that he wanted to end what he called forever wars. So the troop withdrawal should have come as no surprise to us. We've had 18 months and here we are now at this 11th hour trying desperately to extend the air bridge. But that has got to be the priority for today's G7. The Prime Minister is chair of the G7. He needs to bring together those leaders, including France and Germany, who are urging the United States to rethink their decision to leave after the 31st. Every day counts at the moment.
Yeah, it absolutely does. The trouble is, though, even if President Biden would want to do it, he still has to get agreement from the Taliban, doesn't he? And they've made it clear there are going to be consequences. It's a red line date, that if they want to seek additional time, the answer will be no, or there'll be action taken.
Yeah, the Taliban have had a very sort of tough rhetoric around this over recent days. But that's why today is such a crunch moment, because the G7 countries represent a third of the world's economy who are meeting today. They've got £9 billion in assets that were held by the Afghan government in bank accounts, mainly in the United States, but also across other G7 countries as well. And that gives the G7 alone a unique amount of leverage with the Taliban that other international bodies just simply don't have. We are the chair of the G7. And so today is the moment that we could actually make a difference and save many, many lives if we get this right.
And it's right, isn't it? Of course, the Taliban are struggling to get hold of any funds from the International Monetary Fund. And therefore, the idea of sanctions, essentially, is what you're talking about. That in itself is still quite controversial, isn't it? Because when we talk about sanctions, it will hit the Afghani people who are already suffering. And so are you saying that that is a risk worth taking today and in these following days, if it gets to the point where Biden is willing to have that conversation with the Taliban, that he threatens sanctions in order to get an extension to the deadline?
Well, look, the Taliban is a prescribed organisation, so currently there is no prospect of unfreezing those assets that are currently held in the West. But I think we ought to use this moment in order to say to the Taliban that there is a prospect of some level of dialogue and engagement with the international community, but that comes with responsibilities, and those responsibilities include us being able to evacuate all of those who we've made commitments to. It includes upholding human rights. It includes not rolling back the progress that has been made over 20 years on the situation of women and girls. And the G7, although we have limited leverage, we do have leverage. I don't think that sanctions should be used to attack the Afghan people. The Afghan people have suffered enough, but we can design a sanctions regime that targets Taliban leaders rather than the Afghan people themselves, even as we continue to provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Afghanistan. And that's why it's important that the G7 come together today and agree a common approach that does precisely that, to get aid into the country, to step up our contribution, but also to send a very clear message to the Taliban that we need to get our people out and all of those who supported us. And that is the number one condition.
Yeah, and, you know, you talk about them as tough negotiators on the Taliban side and talk about tough rhetoric. Do you trust the rhetoric then when the Taliban say we want to be recognised by the international community, or, as we've heard from many Afghanis themselves, they don't believe a word they say? And so, in a sense, what you're saying is that we have to perhaps barter with the Taliban on the basis that they do want recognition in the international community, rather than kicking the Americans out on the 31st.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I just can't quite believe that we've ended up here after 20 years, hundreds of British troops' lives lost, 150,000 of them deployed over 2 decades, and billions of pounds spent. I just can't quite believe that we're sitting here now in a situation where we're having to negotiate with the Taliban because we didn't plan a proper evacuation over the last 18 months. But nevertheless, we are now in a situation where we have to have some level of dialogue with the Taliban in order to get people out, in order to safeguard those gains, in order to exert the limited leverage that we have. To answer your question directly, no, I don't see any evidence that this is a changed regime. They've come to power through violence. They've overthrown a democratically elected government, and they've been going door to door threatening reprisals against people, hundreds of whom are in touch with my office at the moment and are desperate to leave. So no, I don't see that evidence. I think there is a big difference between diplomatic recognition, which should not be on the cards at this stage, and dialogue with the Taliban, which is absolutely essential if we're going to get people out of the country in the next few days.
And to pick up on how the evacuation process is working, we've got this news today of security breach fears after a person on a no-fly list arrived in Britain. And there are big questions here, aren't there, about the checks that are taking place. Several people on the no-fly list to the UK were stopped. This person managed to get through and arrived in Birmingham. Apparently, officials have said they've now concluded this was not a person of interest to the security agencies. But there are questions about the checks that are being made and obviously heightened security risk because of the situation. We know that a number of terrorist prisoners have been released. There are going to be a lot of people whose attention is suddenly going to be turning to the West, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to pay tribute to all of those staff, and particularly the troops who are in a very, very risky, difficult situation in Afghanistan, who are trying to process these applications as quickly as possible and get people onto planes. They're putting themselves at personal risk to do it. And I gather from talking to people on the ground that this is taking an enormous toll on many people. And they've been left in an absolutely appalling situation. We should have been planning for this, not just 18 months ago when we knew that the US was withdrawing, but years ago. The Defence Select Committee warned that we just simply weren't operating a proper scheme to support those Afghan interpreters 3 years ago. And you contrast what the UK government has done with France, where they started this evacuation early, they processed the paperwork, and they've managed to get their people out. It just cannot be right that we're now in a situation where we have to take these security concerns very seriously. We have to do the proper checks. But by doing that, we're slowing down the process and some people will be left behind. It's just unconscionable that the government could have left people in that situation.
All right, Lisa Nandy, we'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. But thank you so much for talking to us on the programme.
Thanks very much.